Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome once again to Frontiers in Brain Health, where we will be taking another deep dive into cutting-edge science. I'm Dan Krozik, the Deputy Director here and Professor at UT Dallas as well. Welcome to our virtual audience. We will take time for questions at the end, and please use the Q&A function if you have a question, and we will get to some of those online questions as well. And today we have a really fascinating scholar, Dr. Ryan Boyd. Ryan is an assistant professor in psychology at UT Dallas. He's also an affiliated faculty at the Texas Artificial Intelligence Research Institute at UT Dallas as well. He trained at UT Austin with the very legendary Jamie Pennebaker, who is a real fixture in the language and behavior world, and had previous appointments at Lancaster University in the UK, as well as Stony Brook University before coming to Dallas. And his work particularly came to my attention over our shared interest in human values and decision making, but his scholarly career touches on an extremely wide diversity of really fascinating and important topics. These include evaluating personality, examining politics and culture, the effects of stress on our well-being, food preferences, mental health, relationships, persuasion, and also measuring behavior on social media. So I really think that Ryan will have something interesting for all of us, given that wide diversity. He had described himself as a sailor, using a sailing analogy for interdisciplinary research, and what he means by that is basically moving amongst different scholarly communities and being part of those different traditions and those different cultures. If you're talented enough to do that, there's tremendous power in that for interdisciplinary work, which he has exhibited repeatedly. And he looks at language as a window to the mind, and that's a very old pillar concept in mind and brain, but he's doing it with a new set of tools and a new, fresh approach that's very technological. And so part of his integration has been to use language models and machine learning to basically add quantitative measures to traditionally qualitative topics. It's very much needed, and I think his work will have a major impact, especially where we are as a society with the amount of words and amount of numbers and amount of modeling that's going to happen. He's already had a major impact. He's published over 80 papers and has an H-index over 40. Extremely rare for such a new person to the field. And he's a very unique and energizing scholar, about to make even bigger contributions as time goes on. So let's welcome Dr. Ryan Boyd.
Someone read my blog. I've made it. Well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining me on this beautiful, sunny Texas afternoon. I am going to talk about a lot of different stuff today. Some of it will be fairly superficial. Really, I just kind of want to give you a walking tour of a lot of different types of projects across a lot of different areas of psychology and really the social sciences that I've been dabbling in for the past, 10 or 15 years or so. So really think of this as kind of an introduction or just little spotlights on different topics that are at this intersection of psychological science, computation, and language or verbal behavior. Before I jump into it, acknowledgements. I'm going to talk about a lot of different projects. All of this stuff has been in collaboration with a huge number of really, really smart, really talented people across a lot of disciplines. Psychology, computer science, information science, communication, business, and on and on and on. So I'm going to say, I found this and we found this. These are just some of the people who've really played a huge role in making all this happen. So teamwork makes the dream work, as they say. So let's start with a little guessing game. This is a fun one. So let's say we take a massive amount of language data, just a huge boatload of words, tweets, social media stuff, over a pretty long period of time, and we're looking at just 3 words, 3 very small, simple words. And as we're tracking them over time, we see a big change pop up. Now, something happened. We love this in the social sciences for naturalistic experiments. Something happened, and pretty much overnight, the ways in which people were talking changed dramatically. The use of these 3 teeny words doubled, and then there were these other things that caused it to keep popping up over and over and over again. These aren't 3 magic words, they're not 3 special words. I can almost guarantee every single person in this room has said at least one of these words at least once today, even before lunch, and you've probably all said them actually lots and lots and lots of times just up to this point. And you probably aren't even aware that you were saying them. You probably couldn't pinpoint when you said them or in what context or anything like that. Does anyone want to take a guess at what those 3 words are? I love you too, Sandy. These are good guesses. I'll give you a hint. We'll get a little bit closer. So this will help us identify what the event was that caused this change. COVID, that's right. These 3 words spiked during a number of different COVID-related events. Lockdown, different COVID surges, and then some of these other spikes correspond to other events that were happening over time. Black Lives Matter protests, Roe v. Wade being overturned. 3 words. Any guesses? Good guesses, but nothing internet related. Even simpler. Those 3 words are we, us, and our. Now, these are seldom words that we make a conscious choice to use. We're usually not even aware that we're using them, but they do strongly suggest, particularly in a context like this, some sense of shared identity, some sense of togetherness, some connective tissue between people. Now that plot came from a study that we published, I think last year, looking at about 2.5 million people posting to different subreddits corresponding to 30 major US cities. And it's not specific to the US. We see the same pattern show up over and over again in different data sets, in different countries, in different types of contexts. Really, in the face of any type of major challenge, people have this strong psychological need to feel like they belong, to have connection with other people. These aren't new insights, but we can see it in their language. And what these findings show is essentially that language itself, even these simple words, are part of the infrastructure of that psychological sense of belongingness. Humans are social animals, after all. We'll go with a much easier example. So, same 3 words, we, us, and our, unfolding over the course of a year. And we have 3 distinct time points. We have a massive spike at the end of February in we words. Another pretty major bump up towards the end of April. And something really strange happens in the autumn and winter. We see these repeated bumps where we words keep going up over and over and over again, several times. Any guesses as to what the event is? Close. This is Texas. Sports. It's the NFL. Makes sense. So we took all 32 subreddits for all NFL teams, and again, we plotted we words over time. The Super Bowl, it more than doubles, where collective identity really, really spikes up. Draft day, people get very kind of togethery in their psychology. And then when we line up game days for each one of the teams, we words spike for those specific teams on game days. And what's really cool too is if we look at self-referential language, I words, I, me, and my, they show the pretty much inverse pattern. On game days, I words I can't really see the dot, but they dip down below baseline on game days. So on game days, identity becomes much more collective, much more expansive, and much less self-focused. So what we're showing here essentially is that identity itself, which we often talk about as a pretty static or stable thing, I am this person, I belong to this group, is actually something that is very, very dynamic over time. These patterns really underscore this simple but pretty powerful point that belongingness rises and falls in reaction to different types of events, language serving a really core part of how we construct that identity, how we make sense of it, and how we express it as well. And again, really across context, whenever there's any kind of common stakes that people have, the words that people are using show when the group part of their identity is lighting up. Now, these are really kind of fun and interesting examples, we words, COVID, etc. But lots and lots and lots of people study language. They have for a long time across a lot of disciplines. And you hear people, depending on their academic background, they'll use different metaphors to try to convey what they think language means or what it does. So in philosophy and evolutionary biology, you'll hear the metaphor often of language as a tool or a social technology, something that we've evolved, that we use to increase our survival through cooperation, et cetera. In cognitive sciences, you'll often hear people talk about language as some type of a mental model or mental map that people use to kind of track and update their understanding of reality. In communication sciences, information sciences, they'll often talk about code or information packets. Language is this kind of box of information that we pass back and forth. We encode it, we decode it, and we use this to share information with one another. All of these metaphors are absolutely right. All of these fields are thinking about language in a really useful, meaningful, important way. But from my background, coming from a very heavily, we'll say, behavioral science background in psychology, there's a way to think about language that doesn't really require a metaphor or any greater complexity than language is a behavior. It is something that we do. Every word we use is some action that we use to engage with the environment, the world around us. Now, psychology itself is a broad discipline. We say that we're concerned with coming up with theories and laws that govern the ABCs of mental life: affect, behavior, and cognition. And of course, these things all influence one another. Our emotions influence our behaviors influence our thoughts, and so on. And we can learn a lot about mental life, in particular emotions and cognitions, by simply asking people. We can give them questionnaires, we can measure a lot of things that are kind of the downstream consequences of different patterns of thoughts and emotions, but we can't directly observe them. We can't physically touch a person's thoughts. We can't directly measure a person's inner subjective experience. And this is why I like behavior so much, verbal behavior in particular. We know from over a century of really serious scholarship in the behavioral sciences that behavior tells us a massive amount about a person's psychology, patterns of thinking, ways of engaging with the world, how they interact with other people, who they are as a person inside, fundamentally. You can capture this through behavior, and we can directly observe and measure behavior without having to make inferences about what's going on in the mind. So, as an example, imagine that like a big, fuzzy, grumpy bumblebee came buzzing through this room right now. Different people, you'd have very different psychological reactions to that. Some people would be scared, some people would be unbothered, some people would be angry at the bee for some reason, maybe had a bad day, didn't get enough sleep. And you would be able to infer a lot of this based on individual behavior, how people reacted. Some people might try to shoo the bee away, some people would scream and run away. Probably one person here would like take off their shoe and just whack it and end the whole ordeal. It sounds like a lot of people would take off their shoe and whack it. So behavior itself and verbal behavior has some special properties here that we'll touch on in a little bit. It tells us a huge amount about what's happening in a person's mental life. Now, if we look through the history of psychology of behavior, one of the key lessons is if we really want to understand how behavior relates to psychology, we should start with really common high-frequency behaviors that are happening all the time for a couple of reasons. One of them is it's just easier. If we're trying to understand psychology through really rare or infrequent behaviors, it's really hard to capture those, to measure those when they happen. And also, behaviors themselves, when they are very common, when they're high-frequency types of behaviors, they tend to be very habitual, they tend to be very automatic. They kind of constitute the behavioral fabric of a person's everyday mental life. Now, if we take that idea and apply it to language, if we want to understand language as a behavior through the most frequent types of verbal behaviors, the most frequent words that people use, we see something that is, on its face, pretty nonsensical. So across millions and billions of words that English speakers use, millions of people, we usually see something that looks about like this. These are the top 25 most common words in the English language in terms of frequency of use. And these top 25 words, only 25 words, account for over a third of all of the words. Whoa, that got loud. I got really excited. All of the words that people write, that they read, that they say, that they hear. And the typical human vocabulary in English, adults 18 and up, is somewhere between 10,000 and like 40,000 words. 25 words account for a huge amount of what we're doing. But what's really interesting about this is if you look down this list of words, most of them don't really mean anything. You don't see words like happiness or friendship or talk or anything like that. It's a lot of these words that historically computer scientists completely throw away when they're trying to do language modeling. They just don't carry any semantic value. They don't mean anything on their own. So the word "the" doesn't mean anything on its own. Now, and these are also the types of categories of words that were just torturous to learn about in like elementary school, like prepositions and articles, words like the and but and for and so on. All of these words belong to a special category of language called function words, sometimes called particles. Now, these are essentially the syntactic glue of language. They hold language together, but they don't mean anything on their own, just in isolation. The context always determines the meaning of these words. So even if we go back to like the football example, the word "we" doesn't necessarily mean the same thing from person to person, from context to context. When I use the word "we" right now, it means everyone in this room. If you go home and use the word "we," you might be talking about your family. The literal meaning of the word "we" changes very dramatically based on when it's used, where it's used, who's using it, and on and on and on. But what's really cool about most of these function words is that the psychological function of them is very constant. So "we" always implies some sense of shared connection between other people. It doesn't matter if you like the people, if you dislike the people. When you say "we," it means you and at least one other person where there's some logical thread that connects the two of you. Now, we generally accept that pretty much all words that people use, and this is long-standing theory in psychology, tells us about their attention. The words people are using tracks their attention. If they're thinking about themselves, they're more likely to reference themselves. If they're thinking about how they feel, they're more likely to use emotional words. If they're thinking about their own thoughts, they're likely to use words like think and know and so on and so forth. And what this allows us to do is take a person's words and indirectly trace a route back to things that are happening in their mind, habits of thought, what they're thinking about, when they're thinking about it, and on and on and on. And what's great is that there's a huge amount of individual variation in all these categories of function words. It's not that everyone uses the word "the" at the same rate. There are subtle variations. Some people use it at a rate of about 4% of their words. Some people 6%, some people 3.8%. They sound like very small differences, but these are dramatic shifts from a statistical perspective. And it's not just those. You see it in terms of pronoun use. People have individual differences in how much they use I, me, and my versus second person pronouns like you and your. There's differences in how often people refer to different tenses just through function words themselves, whether they're talking in the present tense. Past tense tends to suggest more rumination. Future tense suggests kind of more looking forward, just in how they're oriented towards the world. The same is true, even again, just with function words. You can capture things like how, we'll say, cognitively rigid a person is. Are they using a lot of absolutist language? Things that are very certain, always and never, versus maybe and sometimes. These are all function words that track ways that people think. Now, there's, in the English language, depending on who you ask, around maybe 700 function words or so. I promise I'm not going to spend the next 40 minutes like torturing you with all 600 function words. So I'm going to cut to some of the high-level stuff. We'll pull the camera back a little bit. Across a lot of different studies, people found that if you do data reduction techniques, if you do things like a factor analysis of function words, you get a lot of core psychological dimensions that seem to be reflected in function words. One of the most consistent ones that emerges is what we would call thinking style. It's essentially, is a person using lots of articles and prepositions. Articles are essentially noun signifiers. Prepositions describe relationships between concepts, above, under, next to, things like that. On the other end of the spectrum, people tend to use lots of pronouns. They tend to use lots of adverbs and on and on and on. Essentially, what this dimension tracks is whether or not someone is more oriented towards ideas and abstract concepts and how they relate to one another, so a very analytical way of thinking and organizing the world, or if people are more socially oriented. Are they concerned primarily with people, what they're doing, and in particular how they're doing it and with whom and so on. Now, this dimension emerges purely statistically over and over and over again. You can think of this as mapping onto like a dual process model of cognition. So if you've ever heard of like System 1 and System 2, Daniel Kahneman, stuff like that, it tracks that fairly closely, and lots of other dual process models. So sometimes we call it categorical thinking versus dynamic thinking, analytic versus intuitive, rational versus experiential, and on and on and on. Doesn't really matter how you label it. Those are the things that it tends to track. And these dimensions of thought that emerge from function words tend to be incredibly trait-like, incredibly stable within the individual. So if you're someone who uses a lot of articles and prepositions today, you're likely to be using higher rates of those words tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, next decade, and on and on and on. They're very habitual, much like our patterns of thought. And we've done this across a number of different studies. This is just a fun one where we did an authorship attribution task. So there's this play, Double Falsehood, also originally called Cardenio, and it was published in the 1720s by a guy named Louis Theobald. He said he found a couple of manuscripts of a lost Shakespeare play. And so he said, I made a couple changes to it, but I published it. This is an original Shakespeare, it's legit. And then a few years later, I lost the manuscripts in a fire, whoopsie. And no one believed him. Pretty much everybody hated Louis Theobald. He was very, very intellectual, but very interpersonally icy, very pedantic. Alexander Pope wrote parodies about him. Alexander Pope became much more famous. And so this question persisted. There was this hot debate for a couple hundred years. Is this a real Shakespeare play or not? When we just look at the analytic thinking measure, we did this with a zillion batteries of language, but just the analytic thinking measure alone, and we look at Shakespeare on this, I need to get better at this microphone. I need more practice. Shakespeare's in the middle, Theobald is on the right. Shakespeare's friend and regular collaborator, John Fletcher, is on the left. We analyze all of the plays that they wrote, sonnets that they wrote, and you see virtually no overlap here. Each one of them had a very distinct thinking style that actually matched to reports of what they were like as people. Louis Theobald, very cold, very calculating, highly analytic in his language. And this is true. He even wrote some sonnets and other works where he said, I'm trying to mimic the style of Shakespeare. I'm going to write a sonnet in the style of Shakespeare. No one will be able to tell the difference. Doesn't look anything like Shakespeare. His function words alone betray his identity every single time. And as it turns out, the play actually does look like very, very, very strongly like it was written by Shakespeare, and with a little bit of collaboration from his friend. Also, don't publish papers on Shakespeare, because the Shakespeare people send a lot of really unhinged emails and make a lot of threats. I'm still like watching alleys for guys with like ruffled neck things and stuff like that. Dangerous people. Now, function words don't just tell us, there's a lot of different dimensions that we can emerge. It's not just whether or not someone tends to be socially oriented, but they also reveal a huge amount about how we relate to people. So I'm going to show you two examples of a message that the content is basically the same. It's conveying the same idea, but the function words are a little bit different. One of these messages conveys very high status, high confidence. It's someone who's in control. The other one, lower confidence, more insecure, less in control. And we'll guess which one is which. The first one, as you know, the project is moving into its next phase. You'll need to finalize your sections by Friday so the team can review everything early next week. If you run into any issues, you should let me know as soon as possible so we can keep things on track. Here's the second one. I wanted to follow up because the project is moving into its next phase. I was hoping you could finalize your sections by Friday so I can review everything early next week. If there are any issues, I'd really appreciate it if someone could let me know, since I want to make sure things stay on track. Which one is the high status, high confidence one? One on the left. Fantastic. And this, you all get A's for the day. And free lunch. Lunch is on me. This is betrayed heavily by function word use. Across lots and lots of different studies, they find that function word use, in particular pronoun use, tracks people's attention to other people heavily. There's lots and lots of studies that show that people who are higher status, they're in charge, they're more dominant, they're not focused on themselves. They're focused on the people in their environment. What are you doing? You should be doing this. You should be doing that. People who are depressed, who are low status, who are less secure, tend to focus on themselves a lot. They're doing a lot more self-monitoring. Am I doing this right? Am I doing it the right way? What are other people going to think of me? And on and on and on. So the idea that like a really big, dominant boss who uses lots of I words is like a really good boss, wrong, blow hard. And we see this across lots of different studies. We see it when we look at when we look at existing social hierarchies, where we're looking at like employer versus employees, when we're looking at advisors versus grad students. We also see this emerge when we do experimental manipulations. When you take a bunch of strangers, throw them into a group together, and just randomly pick one and say, you're the boss and you all need to work on this task together. In the first minute, people's function words start to change dramatically. They're not aware of it. Other people aren't commenting on it or anything like that, but you see it in their language. And people internalize that very automatically. People fall into line very, very quickly based purely on function words, stuff that we're not even listening for, paying attention to, etc. And this stuff has really, really important consequences in the real world. So this is work that I did with some colleagues a few years ago where we were looking at online sting operations. So people posing as minors online to try to catch online sexual predators. And across about 600 different transcripts, we measured this dimension of social status, what we call it clout. And if you're not familiar with this space, law enforcement, especially these types of operations, there's a lot of rules of engagement. So they can't do a lot of different behaviors that would lead to a case being thrown out for entrapment. So you can't initiate contact with the potential offender. And especially when it's sex crimes, you can't be the person who initiates that topic. You can't bring it up. The idea is you have to allow the person to, of their own volition, be the one who's making these choices to try to pursue this criminal behavior. And so we want to make sure that there weren't other things that were happening as well in these types of interactions, where is an undercover officer unintentionally steering the conversation by conveying dominance in this really subtle way. And the good news is is that that's pretty much how it shakes out. The people who are engaged in these operations, they are successfully using lower status language. They're not subtly leading the conversation and driving it forward, essentially causing a person to engage in behaviors that they might not otherwise engage in. Now, what's really interesting too is for the offenders, when we look at their status language in these transcripts, it's the folks who are exceptionally high in this clout measure who are much, much more likely to reoffend. So these are all people who were actually convicted in the court of law. They did their time, and then we followed up afterwards to see who was reconvicted over the next 10 years or so. And the folks who entered these conversations in a very dominant, controlling way the first time were dramatically more likely to reoffend again, or at least get caught a second time. Now, to be fair, as a note, for this class of crime, recidivism rates are actually pretty low. So we're dealing with a smaller sample there, but just as a caveat. These things also matter majorly in broader society as well. So just super quickly, this is a project where we looked at the language of politicians going back to literally the beginning of the United States, from George Washington up to Donald Trump. And we looked at things like State of the Union addresses, personal letters that they wrote, speeches that they gave, debates, and on and on and on. And we also looked at these same types of language, analytic thinking language and clout language, in the general public, in books and movies and TV shows and on and on and on. And what we see is that around 100 years ago, things started changing, not in the general public, but in politicians. The types of folks who are getting elected are slowly but surely increasingly more confident in their language and less analytic, or more intuitive might be another way to say it. And this isn't specific to the US. We see this in a lot of Western countries over the course of 100 and 200 years. Culture itself is changing. What we're expecting from politicians changes, and we're seeing that reflected in who we're choosing to elect, based in large part based on how they talk. Now, all of that stuff, that's all just function word stuff. So that's taking this small slice of language and making psychological inferences from it. Super duper interesting. What about the rest of language? What about the other 20,000 words that we all know? What does that tell us about people's psychology? And the bad news is that we're going to lock the doors. I'm going to lecture you for 8 more hours on the other words that we all know. The truth is we do tons of work on all the rest of language as well. So not just how are people talking, was the style of their language, but was the content of their language. I'm just going to give some very brief examples of this in the interest of time, just to give you a sense of where a lot of this stuff is going, what we in academia are doing, but in particular out in the world, out in industry, what people are doing with language data that you're posting online and anywhere else. Text messages, doesn't matter. So when we look at topics like mental health, we've done some work over this was pre-COVID, so this was probably like 2018, something like that, where we were looking at the language of students at a large southern university with about 50,000 students or so. And all we did was we went to the subreddit for that university, collected all of the language. Then we want to see how does the stuff that students are talking about map onto the number of visits that the student health centers on campus would get every month. So essentially, can we predict mental health outcomes, or at least support seeking from students as a function of what's on their minds, what are they thinking about, what are they talking about with each other? And we can do a really, really, really perhaps alarmingly good job of predicting the number of students who go to mental health clinic every single month. There are some regularities there where beginning and end of semester, especially right before graduation, you see big spikes anyways. Even when we throw that stuff out, our models based purely on what people are talking about track the real numbers incredibly, incredibly well. And what's nice about this is that we can actually see, well, what are they talking about? What are the things that are on their mind? What might be driving these visits to the health center? And because the way that we're modeling this stuff, we're using some machine learning, but the language that we're measuring is not super black boxy. We can unpack this stuff a little bit. So we see that in months with greater numbers of health center visits, students are unsurprisingly stressed out, but they're stressed out because they're putting in a lot of effort above and beyond usual. They have a lot of pressure from feeling like they're supposed to be achieving things and a lot of usual stressors. They're more likely to be talking about things like money and work and so on. And on the months with lower mental health center visits, again, this lines up fairly well with what we know from lots of different areas of psychology. They're much more likely to be talking about social connections, relationships that they have with other people, which is a huge buffer for mental health, more likely to be talking about religion, and you'll be shocked to hear this, talking about sex. Who knew that college students thought so much about sex? We can also be a lot more theory-driven about it. So that was something where we just said, we're going to measure lots of different topics, different things students are talking about. But what if we have actual theories that we want to test? We don't want to use a purely data-driven approach. So this is one example. We've been doing a lot of projects on suicide risk and suicidality lately. And essentially, what we're trying to do with a lot of this work is bring a lot of different theories and aspects of the field together. So this is a very, we'll say it's a short list. This is like 27 or 28 different items. There's a zillion different risk factors for suicidality. And what you will find if you go to the literature is you have a lot of different people coming from very different backgrounds and disciplines who are working on different aspects. They're putting a lot of time and thought into different areas of risk. Well, if we can see what people are talking about, we can see to what degree are they saying things that seem indicative of different types of risks. And with language, we don't have to go around and think about, can we measure this? Can we measure this? How do we measure this? We just say, let's measure all of them together, see if we can pool all of these different risk factors together to try to better understand what the core risk factors seem to be, try to nudge the field forward in a more unified way. And we can do this a zillion different ways. I'll skip over the technical aspects because it gets really complicated really quickly. A very simplified version of this is you can essentially come up with prototypical statements. This is a type of statement that if someone were to say it, it would be reflective of thwarted belongingness, a kind of difficulty making social connections with other people. I don't fit in anywhere and everyone hates me. We can take that as a prototypical statement and then take a zillion texts and measure how similar is the meaning of this statement to this prototypical statement. So we can measure, is someone saying something that seems like it's very much in the ballpark of that idea, that belief, or something that's very, very different, even though they're both talking about people. One's, talking about having trouble with friends, the other one's talking about family. So they're both social in nature, but there's a lot of nuance here that we really want to capture. And when we do this with a zillion different prototypical constructs across a lot of different theories and pool them all together, we can see exactly which ones seem to really differentiate low, medium, and high risk. This is just one study of many, many that we've done, but we looked at a sample of control, stream of consciousness writing, just write about whatever's on your mind, about 900 people. We looked at the Suicide Watch subreddit, which is, they describe themselves as essentially, it's an online peer support group for people who are struggling with suicidal ideation. And I spent years of my life collecting suicide notes, hundreds of suicide notes, which are just absolutely heartbreaking to read. And so we have different levels of risk up to actual suicide. And we can see how these different risk factors kind of evolve over the suicide trajectory. We have other much more careful repeated measures studies, on and on and on. What we seem to find essentially, excuse me, is that there's high risk for suicidality that seems to revolve around a few core motivational themes. So aversive self-evaluation, so really negative views of oneself, perceived burdensomeness, the feeling that you make everyone else's life harder, and essentially a very, very strong drive to escape negative feelings, trying to get away from it all. Some people, historically, it would be called like psych ache or something like that, a classic Schneidman construct. And what we find is using this approach, this isn't like some state-of-the-art generative AI, so it's not ChatGPT, it's kind of a generation before that. When we stick theory in here, when we say we know what we want to measure, this actually outperforms ChatGPT, all the new kind of generative AI stuff that you hear so much about, and sometimes it outperforms it by quite a lot. Speaking of ChatGPT, what about context? So everything I've talked about up to this point, we're just taking a person's words and completely decontextualizing them. We're not analyzing like discourse, back and forth conversations between people. When we have that, we basically take it apart and analyze each person completely separately. But of course, all of this stuff, all behavior is embedded within an environment. Verbal behavior is often heavily embedded in social environments. The things that we think and feel and say, they impact the people around us and vice versa. So we get this nice virtuous cycle of dynamic social interaction. Now, increasingly, people are filling their social context with chatbots, with generative AI. So this was published, this is a Pew Research Center report. This was published like 5 or 6 months ago, something like that, where they were just seeing how much do people use generative AI. And they found that about a third of US adults say that they are using generative AI several times a day or almost constantly. A third of adults. And 2/3 of people say they're using it at least several times a week. Now, that's a huge amount of social interaction with a very, very new technology. And the truth is we don't actually know a whole lot about what the consequences of this are going to be yet. But the majority of these interactions are through language. We're using language to interact back and forth with these technologies. And despite what a lot of people will tell you and what you'll see in a lot of news articles, this is actually a place where hopefully the social sciences and psychology can actually step up and really shine. We have a massive history of theories and explanations for how social relationships operate, when they operate, how they operate, why they operate, when they're good, when they're bad, how they're maintained, how they dissolve, and so on. And the truth is, human psychology has not changed radically over the past 3 years. The laws that govern the human mind, how we think and feel and behave, are fundamentally the same. The environment is different. There are different things in our environment that we're interacting with, but the psychological principles of social interaction still hold. Now, this has some upsides and downsides. So we did some work, this was several years ago, on persuasion in humans. There's the persuasion literature is a complete dumpster fire. Like, I'm sorry if you're a persuasion researcher, but especially, well, I'll qualify that. Persuasion research when it comes to things like linguistic cues. You can find a zillion studies that say, well, if you frame a message in a more abstract sense, it'll be more persuasive. And then another study says, well, it should be more concrete, more positive, more intellectual, yada, yada. It's all over the place. So this was a super simple study we did with humans where we just said, let's just put it all together. If we just look at every language cue we can think of, in actual real world data where we have ground truth about whether or not a person changed their mind, whether they updated their belief, what ones seem to consistently predict that. Not looking for big effect sizes, just what holds up over time and topic and on and on and on. And we found a few interesting things. We'll go back to that dimension I talked about earlier, analytic thinking. The more analytic a message is, the more persuasive it seems to be, kind of the more categorical, informational it seems to be, and the more there's a sense of authority, a sense of, I know what I'm talking about, confidence, essentially. Now, recent work by some colleagues of mine found that ChatGPT, very, very persuasive, more persuasive than humans in a lot of cases. And when they look at why is ChatGPT updating people's beliefs about politics, about religion, et cetera, they looked at the language cues and it matches exactly what we saw in humans. Now, what could be potentially alarming about this is that these are their default operating styles, essentially. not every human is particularly persuasive. I'm not that persuasive. I'm using lots of self-references right now. Very low status I am. So you find in humans, some people are very persuasive, some less so. These things are very persuasive all the time. They present information in a very coherent, structured, fluent way. They sound like they know what they're talking about. And you can imagine very easily how this can go off the rails. Most of you have probably seen news stories about people going down some really dark rabbit holes with, ChatGPT or character AI or something like that. I'm not saying that this is the only reason why, but certainly a contributing factor. And this is made more complicated by the fact that this is actually going to be coming out, I think, this year. We've done some work where we essentially turn the personality dials on generative AI. So we can train it to talk in different personality styles. Whether we're talking about kind of classic big five stuff, we can make it more extroverted, more introverted, more depressed, talk like an older person, talk like a younger person. There's a huge amount of potential to really fine-tune these things, to talk in very particular ways to very particular people, and we're really just starting to scratch the surface of this. And these are just off-the-shelf models. This isn't some futuristic thing that's going to be happening 10 years from now. This is stuff like we did this with a small team of people recently. And this leads us to some really big questions about what is the future of our relationship to these technologies? If we can make these things more human than human, what does that mean? If they are ideal social partners, if they never get bothered by us, if they're always available, if there's really low, emotional or social friction with these machines, we need to start understanding the conditions under which they essentially supplant or undermine meaningful social connections with other people versus enhancing. The truth is, this is probably going to be a lot like, a decade plus of research on social media. Sometimes it's really good. Sometimes it's incredibly beneficial. Other times it's a complete nightmare and leads to horrible outcomes for people. This is a lot of where my work and my colleagues' work is starting to go these days, is trying to understand the implications and the really pinned by the social psychology of these technologies. Who are they going to help? Who are they going to hurt? Under what circumstances? And on and on and on. And I talked for a really long time, so I'm going to just skip over concluding thoughts. Really, language, super duper interesting. We moved from the smallest words that we don't pay any attention to up to literally the largest computational models of language that have ever been trained in human history. There's a huge amount to unpack here, and 10,000 other things that we could talk about. I'm happy to talk about anything. I'll leave you with a quote. This is one of my favorite quotes by one of my favorite psychologists of all time. This is really for the psychologists in the room and who are watching, but increasingly, Milgram is being proven right in this context. The more and more language we have, we're doing really impressive, sophisticated things that aren't just computational tasks, but they're also deeply revealing of human psychology. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the great insights. Questions?
That was awesome. I had a question about from where the data is gathered, because in one of your early slides, it looked like they came from larger population areas. Do you factor in what's going on in language in rural America and how that correlates with what we're seeing? Because I'm no expert like you are, but it does seem to be there's probably different language formatting and usage in those different communities.
Absolutely, that's a great question. So there's kind of, I could spend an hour on this alone. I'll keep it limited to kind of like socio-demographic types of stuff. So there is an increasing amount of work there. So, in the early days, a lot of what we would do is we'd say, we've got these coarse language measures that are relatively insensitive to context, so things like we words and the and so on. And so we're going to train a model on those. And all we care about is there an association, yes or no? As things have gotten more sophisticated, then we start asking questions like, well, for whom? Under what conditions do these models get very brittle or break down entirely? And there's some very good work by a colleague of mine, Steve Wilson, who's up at University of Michigan now. He's done some stuff on like urban versus rural language and how you need different models for those. There's also a scholar, Jonas Schoen, he's a postdoc at Stanford. He's got a couple of great projects looking at how if you train models, like even just in the English-speaking world, a model to predict well-being in the US just absolutely falls on its face when you apply it to like the UK, for example. There's a ton of work happening here, and we already are aware that like you need different models for different groups of people. We have pretty good intuitions as to why that's the case, but I think we're still in very early days on that, figuring out what parts even matter, what should we care about. Thank you.
This might be a piggyback kind of connected to Stephen's question, goes back to the function words. I think of a word like you, and in the English language, there's you, there's y'all, there's you all, there's yous guys, depending on where you live in the country. But then if you tie that into maybe a romantic language like Spanish, innately they have words that still mean the same, but one might be feminine, one might be masculine, one might be plural. How does that tie into the Reddit data? And I know this might be specific to English, but what would we expect in other languages as well?
It's a great question, and there's a huge amount of nuance here. The short version is that, so for a lot of the early stuff, so we've used, it's a tool, it's called Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count. It's developed by Jamie Pennebaker and Martha Francis, actually at SMU a long time ago. Full disclosure, I'm deeply involved in Luke now, so buy it for your friends and family. It's a great stocking stuffer, birthday parties, doesn't matter. Anyways, the short version is it has a lot of these very simple measures: first person singular pronouns, plurals, second person pronouns, third person pronouns, articles, yada, yada, yada. And we've worked with a lot of people over the years to translate these to other languages. So like the Spanish one was done by a woman who's now a professor at University of Connecticut, Nairon. And I did not envy the amount of work that they had to put into that. Similar with German, we've had translated like Russian, French. It gets really, really complicated in terms of the translation itself, not just the literal translation, but also the cultural translation. What we find, though, is that most of these patterns hold up really, really well. So one of the most robust, or at least well-studied findings, is that first-person singular pronouns tend to correlate with depression. So the more inside one's own head they are, the more difficulty they have kind of putting their thoughts out into the world, tends to correlate with depression. We find that English, Spanish, Chinese, so it's not so much about the particular words that are being used, it's what the words are telling us about how a person is kind of conceptualizing their experience.
I have the microphone here. This is a fascinating presentation, thank you. How would your work get incorporated into K through 12 education? Would it be through like teacher training or parental seminars? I just think it's really needed.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So the reason why I fell into all this stuff in the first place, when I started in grad school, I was doing a bunch of super brutal cognitive stuff. There was like, you bring people in the lab, have them slap at a keyboard for a while, then you pretend that like you learned something about the human mind. And then no offense. I fell into the language stuff because we did a study, it's a whole long story, but I started looking at language and I was like, this is the stuff that actually tells us what a person's experience is. And the more I started looking around, the more I just saw it everywhere. It's why my research program is completely incoherent. Like I don't do research on a single thing. It applies to so many different places and can be used so many different ways. So in like K through 12, for example, there's, language, there's like the old like Dolch sight word list. You can use it to benchmark essentially like, is a kid learning the words at the right levels that they're supposed to learn? But you can imagine in things like parent-teacher conferences to help facilitate kind of smoother interactions, but not that there's ever any friction in those. We have some older work that we did, well, older, it's like 5 years old, where we found function word patterns super consistently take a particular shape in the stories that people write and stories that people tell. We've talked to folks about using that as kind of a training tool for teaching kids how to like write stories, kind of a literary studies type of thing. I could go on and on and on. Essentially, any part of the educational process where language is happening, I think it has a role there. We're doing some work right now where we're doing fine-tuning of large language models, essentially to help challenge a person's ideas. So whatever it is someone believes, it kind of presses it a little bit and says, well, are you sure? Have you thought about it this other way? Things like that. I mean, all of this stuff is transacted through language. I know it's a super hand-waving, vague answer, but like, I'm also very enthusiastic about my research, so it's hard for me not to be like, oh, it matters everywhere, for everything, always, but yeah.
Ryan, so I have a question over here. I mean, really elegant, and I love language, just study discourse and have for many years, so really elegant work. What we find that language models have a hard time is if you think about concepts, because our language is so rich, there's an infinite number of ways to say the same concept. You got at it a little bit, but it's what we find that they have a hard time doing is it's a similar concept, but each of us at this table in this room would say it very differently. How do you do that?
And a lot of models have gotten really, really good at this over the past, we'll say 10 years or so. And this is where I completely gloss over the technical aspects of this. For the work that I was showing on suicide risk, actually I'll back up to that slide, if I can remember. Stuff like this, a lot of models, essentially what we're doing is we're vectorizing the language. We're making a 512 dimension vector, so 512 numbers that roughly approximate what does this text mean, what does this sentence mean. And then you can do really simple kind of geometric statistics to say, the meaning of this is right here, the meaning of this is really, really similar to it. These are things that have been trained on unbelievable amounts of language data. I guess the short answer is a lot of models are actually really, really good at this these days. Where a lot of them still struggle is negation. So it'll say something like, if you say, I'm happy versus I'm not happy, the model reads it essentially as, oh, we're talking about happiness. That's what the sentence is about. So they're really, really similar, despite the fact that anyone in this room would say those have literally polar opposite meanings to one another. There's work in that space, and I'm sure that I'm supposed to shut up very, very soon, so I'll stop there. But.
Well, Ryan, we did want to get to one online question, which is quite important. If you could just talk about the use of publicly available social media posts as data, how that works in terms of just informed consent, privacy, and I guess in a broader note, how does social media verbiage affect the analysis? Because people are different online than they are in real life.
Not me.
You're a sailor, online and in real life. Others, maybe not so much.
Yeah, so there's kind of two questions. The first is, I think, if I'm following the question correctly, really one of ethics more than anything. So, people post things online. Is it okay to even use their data? There's hand-wavy answers that can be given. There's kind of more ethically sound answers that can be given. I'll try to split the difference on this so that I don't go on for 20 minutes. So the classic logic of using public internet data is essentially it constitutes public behavior. And this connects with a long tradition psychology of if someone does not have any reasonable expectation of privacy, then it's kind of okay. If someone's in a park doing something, it's okay to see that, notice it, write it down. If they're doing it in the privacy of their own home, you shouldn't do that. You should not be looking in their window and taking notes for research. Historically, some of the simple logic was essentially, if it's a website where you have to log in, if not just anybody can come along and see it, that's completely out of bounds. They have an expectation of privacy. You have to respect that. Doesn't mean that Facebook or OpenAI does, but we do. We follow those ethics pretty closely. I'll leave that on the shelf. I'm not an ethicist, but there's mountains of discourse on that topic. In terms of the other half of the question, really it's about domain. So even just the jargon people use, very different online versus face-to-face, unless you're like 12 years old. It's all incoherent to me these days. That's why I knew I was old. I was like, I don't understand anything these kids are talking about. The fact that I said these kids made me feel bad. But there are kind of semantic principles that govern all of this. So jargon is something that's very, very heavily studied and pretty well understood in like sociolinguistics, for example. On the computational side of things, there's methods called things like domain adaptation, where you can train a model in one place and essentially then retrain it in another place so that it takes what it already learned in one context and then updates how it represents that in a new context. So a lot of work has been done where you can train a model using social media data and then take the same model, essentially adapt it to the new domain, whether we're talking about things even from Facebook to Twitter or X or whatever the hell it's called now. The language is different even from platform to platform, let alone online, real life, speeches versus newspapers, conversations versus personal writing. There are tons of methods that have been very, very cleverly thought up, tested, well vetted, well validated to handle a lot of these types of problems.
Fantastic. All right. I feel like you've given us a glimpse of like the dark energy of words. It's like they're all around us, but we didn't notice these insights before. So thank you once again, Ryan.
Thank you.
Join us for Brain Health Week, which comes up late next month in February. And we have a QR code there, and check the website to see all the events, and definitely sign up for events. It will be popular. And we hope to see you again next Friday when we have Dr. Andrew Michael, Director of Analytics and Informatics at the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences, talking about data to diagnosis. So we'll see you next week. Thank you.